There's no doubt if you're running a full race, you want to be as prepared as possible. This time near the end of summer is also the perfect time to practice your race day conditions, since we're still far enough out from most major marathons that you can figure out what works and tweak your strategy if needed. This isn't just limited to pacing though, since nutrition, warm-up, and other variables are all things that you can practice ahead of time. Today, RC coach Andie joins me to talk about how and why you need to practice your race day strategy. I've personally been guilty of not worrying about my nutrition or what I'm going to wear and hoping it all comes together on race day. And this might work some of the time, but practicing takes away a lot of the stress and makes sure that you're prepared for when things go wrong. If anyone else listening ran Boston this year, you probably knew to prepare for the hills, but it was a tough day if you hadn't planned ahead for the heat. That's just one example, but we covered 5 things you can practice ahead of time, including pacing, pre-race routine, nutrition, course conditions, and your racing kit. They say there's no time like the present, so let's get started. Andie, welcome back to another show. The Olympics, as we're recording this, are in full swing, but for the everyday runners, we're also getting close to race day, and that makes it the perfect time to start practicing. How are you feeling as we get close to a lot of your athletes running their goal races?
So this is a lot of the conversation I feel like we're having as we enter the fall, especially with a lot of the marathons that are coming up starting, I think, around September timeframe. So, I've been talking to athletes about this in tune-up races just because you can use a lot of different tactics in a variety of methods, using tune-up races, workouts, all those kinds of things to really start to prep for race day because, race day is like, it's kind of like as if it were a performance, right? You're not just going to get ready the day of the performance, you're practicing through practice. So yeah, excited to get to kind of dive into it.
Yeah, and we're going to cover a ton of topics over the course of this show, but just thinking from your own experience, I know you're just healing up an injury right now and maybe not fully running, but typically as you get ready for a goal race this time of year, what are some of the main things you're thinking about practicing?
Yeah, so depending upon, even if I'm racing something longer, if it's been a while since I've raced, I want to race. I want to have practice just sort of what it feels like to kind of push yourself to your limit. And so from that regard, if you haven't raced in a while and you have a big race that you're training for, or you're just starting your training, generally like a 5K is not going to be the best translation to what your performance may be in the marathon. But from a racing perspective, it helps to have some experience just sort of getting competitive or just sort of feeling what it feels like to just kind of reach that maximum, push yourself. And some of that stuff is some of the things that I fear the most at the beginning of a training cycle is the pushing yourself aspect of it. Like, it's a little bit scary to kind of feel that, and you sort of have to train your body and your mind to be able to kind of experience what that's like, to learn how to push yourself when it gets hard at the end. And so that's something that I always am thinking about from the very beginning of a training cycle, before I'm even getting close to the race, the goal race. And so those tune-up races, we don't have to treat them exactly like our goal races, but we can treat them as, to get something out of them. So finding what about every tune-up you race you do, what can be something that we can utilize this tune-up race that's going to help us in the goal race. And so if you're running a 5K early in the training cycle and you're getting ready for a marathon, then we can use that to just sort of like get our mind ready or get our legs kind of to feel that end of the spectrum, which we don't get in training. So there's stuff like that I think about. The other things I think about are just, how am I going to, what's my pre-race routine going to be? How am I going to fuel? What am I going to eat? Those types of things, in the summer months when I'm training, depending on when the race is. So if you're used to racing in the morning, but you're running an evening race, what are we going to do to prepare ourselves for what that feels like? Because I think that's something we don't always recognize as being something that could potentially be something we have to work on, right? Because we think like, oh, it doesn't matter. Like, I run in the morning, I run in the evening, doesn't matter. But from the perspective of racing, how do you fuel yourself throughout the day when you're on a race day if it's an evening race? And if you're used to running in the evening, how do you fuel yourself just the morning of if it's a morning race? So those are other things that I consider when I'm thinking about the races that I'm doing and kind of what I'm preparing for, is really trying to get into what is this race going to be like? What time is it going to be at? All those different things are things that we can, start to develop good practices around and really get a good system together so that when we get to race day, all those pieces, we're just putting them together, or there's not things we have to think about, or you don't have to look back at that race and be like, oh, I made all these mistakes, I didn't think about that, or I didn't think about this. And I have one experience where I raced a hilly half marathon. It was going into the 2016 trials. I was like, oh, I'll do a half as a tune-up, but I didn't look at the course. and it was very hilly the first few miles. And so I was like, oh, I'm going to go and I'm going to practice my marathon pace for the beginning and then try to finish strong. And not doing any of that background, that leg work to kind of be like, oh, what's this course going to be like, really ruined that whole, it just didn't come together the way I wanted it to. Whereas if I had been prepared from that perspective to know it's hilly in the front side, really learning to run with the effort on that could have benefited me. I still could have gotten the same thing out of it. But instead, it just kind of really put me in a weird headspace going into my goal race, because that was the only race I had between that race and the trials. And so I kind of fumbled that opportunity to practice and that opportunity to really put all these things together. And so we can use all types of experiences, workouts, all those things to really help us to prepare for things like that, so that, any unexpected things, we at least have something in our back pocket that we know how to manage or control. So
I think those were some great points, Andie, especially the piece about the mental preparation is super relevant, because the episode just before this, I'm not sure if you're aware as you made some of those comments, but we have an episode that just came out on kind of mental strategies for racing and mental performance. So I think a lot of tie in there and how these strategies actually kind of prime you for race day. But I want to make sure that we touch more specifically on a lot of the items you said, because there's so many things that you can practice beforehand when it comes to racing that I think a lot of people don't even realize. The first one I want to get into is, for the race itself, your pacing. So what is it you can do to actually nail down your pacing before you get to race day?
Yeah, so I think this is one of those things that in training is super important, that if you're running a marathon as your goal race, you want to really start to nail down what your marathon pace is and what it should feel like. So that's where, when we have a workout where you're targeting marathon pace, it's important that you don't go much faster, because otherwise it really starts to kind of create this space where you think that you're working harder than you should be for marathon pace. So we're not practicing what that feels like. So from that regard, I like to have workouts that I give some of my athletes where we sort of practice our pacing strategy. So one of the last workouts I give a lot of the athletes I work with who were training for a marathon is sort of a pace practice long run. And so we have a chunk that's steady, like a more of a steady effort, sort of like how you want to approach those first few miles of a race. So sort of like your first 3 or so miles of the race where you're just getting into it, really holding yourself back on that pace, on that side of the pace range, and then doing a chunk of miles at the marathon effort. And the way that I describe what these miles should feel like is, you're going to have already run some miles, you're going to have miles in your legs, and you're not tapered. So that marathon chunk should feel like the, miles between 13 and 18 or somewhere in that regard. That's what that marathon pace segment should feel like. So if you're feeling like you're having to work way hard to run what your goal marathon pace is, then you probably want to back that off a little bit. We want to be mindful that shouldn't feel like we're going all out in that marathon segment. And if we are, maybe we're working a little too hard. And then the last little bit of this pace practice is actually sort of, let's push ourselves there. Let's actually get ourselves into like what we want to feel like when we're finishing. So simulating what those last few miles, maybe even that last 6 miles might feel like, where it feels you're tired, your mind is starting to doubt yourself, and you want to sort of practice the pacing from both ends of the spectrum. How are you going to mentally handle what that feels like? How are you going to keep engaged when it is hard in that space? And how are you going to sort of remind your body that you can do it when you're tired? And so those last few miles there, practicing sort of going a little bit faster, help us from both the mental side and the physical side, because we can sort of see how it shakes out. One way that I like to recommend people race is that they don't look at their pace in the last little bit of the race, just because I think that sometimes you're going to feel like you're slowing down because it feels hard. But a lot of times, if you don't know, you could be running faster, and that's why it feels hard. And so I've always sort of felt like I've run faster and better when I trick myself into thinking I am slowing down. And so I'm just racing like I'm just trying to keep my pace. And then I end up surprising myself and having run faster, which is something that, we don't, if you kind of take a look at your watch, a lot of times you'll be like, oh, this feels hard. I don't think I can keep going at this pace. So there's mind games that will happen. And so I like having something like that towards the end of a workout too, to practice how, like, not looking at your watch. 'Cause I think a lot of us have that like instinct of like, oh, I need to check my pace when it beeps, And so maybe if we don't practice doing that in training, we can sort of figure out what that feels like. And I always now I feel excited when I don't look at my pace towards the end of a workout or a race, because it's kind of, for me to get to the finish line, it's kind of exciting to see how fast I'm going to finish, whether that's great or not great. Like whether, my last marathon, I was undertrained for it. And so I don't know. I stopped looking at the watch when it started getting hard and just started racing by feel and trying to just like get to the finish line. I felt like I was just dragging. And when I looked back at my splits, I was like, I did slow down, but I was like, oh, it felt like I was going like a good 2 minutes slower than I actually was. So that was like, that gave me some, I think, some like sort of positive energy looking back at it, given, and so that's something I've learned from it. And I feel like now in future races, I know that if it feels like that, then I'm fine, I'm okay, that I just need to keep going with what my body's going to do. And so the reason why I always say not to look at it is that your body has its limits, it has its capabilities, and no matter what you see on the watch, it's not going to change what your body's going to be able to do in that last little bit, unless you give yourself that mental block of like, oh, I don't think I can hold this pace towards the end of the race. That's the only time it's going to slow you down. So why care? Why not just race with a little bit less abandon and just run? Because once you get to a certain point in the race, it doesn't matter if you start running 20 seconds a mile faster, because you're not going to run out of energy before the line. You know what I mean? At that point, you can just run as hard as you can. And the likelihood of you just completely bonking at that point is, pretty low, right? Unless you really are going minutes faster or something and you don't realize it, which is hard to do at the end of a race. But yeah, so like from any racing perspective, even if you're running a 5K, even if you're running half marathon, any of those things, like we want to know what it feels like to run our paces. So doing some workouts at the pace that we're gearing up for, feeling what those feel like. And so that way, when we put it together on race day, we don't start out too quick. We want to make sure we don't do that. And then we want to be able to get settled in and then hold that pace. And then, know how we're going to keep going through when it gets hard. And so how do we want to approach that? And by the same token, if you want a negative split, practice negative splitting in practice. If you're planning to positive split, which, probably not the best solution unless the course is that way, practicing that in practice is important. And then the other thing that I think that this is the biggest benefit of practicing your pacing in training is if you're racing a course that's going to be hilly, you're not necessarily going to be holding a consistent pace throughout. And you probably shouldn't be, because if you were to keep, say your goal pace was 9-minute pace, if you were to keep 9-minute pace on the uphills and the downhills, you're going to be wiped pretty quickly. It's going to be a lot harder to race that way. So when you're racing a hilly race, you're going to have to practice pacing on a hilly course, which means you're going to have to get used to what the variability in pace is going to be like. So what effort you should be going on the uphills and what effort should feel like going on the downhills to keep that consistent effort towards whatever goal pace you're hoping for. And so that's where really practicing your pacing strategy through what the course conditions are going to be like is going to have a really big benefit.
Yeah, I really like that you emphasize practicing what it's going to feel like instead of the pace, because I've had the same experience as you described, where a lot of the races where I haven't looked at my watch and I've gone by feel have been some of my most successful.
Yeah, and I mean, your body is going to be, that's the one thing we also tell people is that like we can have a goal race for ourselves all day. But if your body is not ready for that, or if that's not the day that your body has come with, then there's not a whole lot that you can do, but you can control how you respond to it and how you race to get the best out of yourself on that day. And so we can't force ourselves to run any pace. As great as it would be to be able to just be like, I want to run a 2:30 today and do it. We can't force ourselves into fitness. So, that's where those training days really are important, because, you can have a goal pace given to you and then those are all kind of, we give you a goal pace. It's like, this is your marathon pace, but you really have to be thinking about that in practice of like, is this a realistic goal pace for me? Do I need to slow down? Is it hot? Do I need to sort of be a little bit conservative here so that and maybe when I get closer to race day, we will find out what that's like. But feeling out your efforts is going to be the best way to know if we're actually training the right stimulus to get us ready for the goal race. And so that's where I encourage a lot of athletes to actually practice what things feel like and really trying to separate themselves from the watch a little bit, just generally, even in workouts. If you can find a way to maybe check your pace on the beginning side of things to keep yourself in control, but then start to kind of train yourself to just sort of get on autopilot a little bit and sort of feel those things out, that can be really valuable from a racing perspective because you're really training yourself to know what the effort should feel like. So if race conditions do end up hot, you know what the effort should feel like, so that if you need to slow that pace down on the front side, you can still match the effort and still get a really quality run out of it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And when you think about sort of what race day is going to feel like, I want to extend on that and look at before the race with your pre-race routine, because I think this is something else that runners can practice. But in particular, I'd love to hear your thoughts on just how specific you have to be with practicing it. And what I mean by that is a lot of the time, if you have an early morning marathon at 6 or 7 a.m., you could be waking up super early in order to make sure that you get to the start line on time and get in your fuel. So what are the elements of your pre-race routine that you want to make sure that you're practicing? And what are some of those elements that you can maybe leave to race day?
Yeah, I think getting some practice in on getting up early, going through your full routine of what you want to do to know what works, and doing it a couple times, because you want to be able to see if you want to know, like, will it help me to hop in the shower real quick in the morning when I first wake up to just loosen up my muscles? You want to try that on a different day. You want to try that maybe on a long run workout day or something similar to what your goal race will be, but not necessarily your goal race. So you want to be able to know if those things are actually going to do anything as opposed to just being like, oh, they say you should do X, right? Never want to do anything. And even if they are valuable, you're taking a huge risk if you're just deciding to do something you read online, just because it says that could help you. And so those are things you really want to make sure you practice, because not everything's going to work for everybody. I think even when we talk about caffeine is one of those things that, yes, it can have a performance stimulating effect, but not everybody has the same response to caffeine. So if you're like, oh, I want to have this boost from caffeine, but you're not used to taking caffeine, you could cause yourself new issues by deciding to do that on race day. So what I typically do is, I've never really been one that kind of does all my pre-race practicing of race day stuff of waking up at a different time. I will normally just practice the timing of when I get up from that point to when I am going to race. So if I'm going to get up 2 hours before the race, I'm going to wake up and do something 2 hours before the race. If my race is at 6 a.m., I haven't really done personally waking up at the 2 hours before that to train for. Like that, I haven't done that before races before, just because from my perspective, a lot of times when there's a race coming up, people don't sleep well as it stands. And so when you wake up in the morning, you may be a little bit more kind of like on edge. You're probably not going to be waking up as groggy. So it's really hard to actually simulate what you're going to feel like waking up on race morning, because like I always end up like not sleeping well. And then I wake up sort of wide awake at the time that I'm like supposed to get up. So I feel like if I did that in training, like if I was racing something that started at 6 a.m. and I had to get myself up at like say 3 a.m., you're more likely going to be getting not enough sleep, and that's not going to be valuable to that, especially if you have a big workout that day. Like what if that impacts how your workout goes? And if that workout doesn't go well, is that going to impact your race day? So you have to kind of think about what are my costs going to be? So if waking up at 3 a.m. is going to make you get less sleep and then impact one of your biggest workouts or any of those types of things, then it's not worth it, in my opinion. I think if you just kind of give yourself the same window of time from wake up to when you start your workout as you're going to give yourself on race day, I think that's generally enough of practice. By that same token, though, if you're racing in the morning versus the evening, that's where things really do change, like I mentioned. And when I was in school, we actually had practice at different times of the day, depending upon the season, because cross-country races were in the morning and track races are in the evening. That's just how it was. So we would practice in the mornings in cross-country season and in the afternoons in track season, just to kind of actually prepare ourselves for that, because those are drastically different things. Waking up at 6 versus 8, not going to be a huge difference, right? But waking up and having a race that's like 12 hours later, yeah, that's going to be something that is going to be different, that you're going to want to have some practice with. And so those are things that's where that timing of when you wake up is going to have a little bit more significance. But in terms of your previous routine, the things that I would really focus on practicing are your hydration. What are you going to drink with your breakfast? What are you going to have in the morning? What's your plan for that going to be? What are you going to fuel with and when? Whether that be like, okay, you eat a normal breakfast 2 hours out, and then you have a banana or a gel or something like maybe 30 minutes or near at the start line of the race. those things, all those things are things you're going to want to sort of test out and see how they work and how you feel doing those things. So those are the biggest things that I'm like, go ahead and get that nailed down. I pretty much before every single one of my workouts feel the same way that I plan to feel on my race day. It's just kind of my habit. I will have my UCAN and mixed with some pre-workout, and then I'll have some toast with peanut butter or nut butter or something. And that's what I do for races too. So I've gotten that really used to that. My stomach handles it well. I feel good with it. And so those are things that I've sort of already nailed down. Aside from that, like there's other little things that you can. Do you like doing stretches, or do you, like I said, hop in the shower? Do you like to go do a little shakeout when you first get up in the morning? Any of those things are going to be things that you're going to want to really make sure that they are things you like to do and practice them and see how they feel. And so that you have all that stuff nailed down. When you get to the race, what is your pre-race, like a warm-up and stuff? Those are things you also want to consider. How much time do you need to be at the starting area before? Like I like to get myself there at least an hour, because I like some decompression time before I start my warm-up. And then I tend to start my warm-up around 45 minutes before the race so that I can get a little warm-up jog in. I can do drills, I can do my strides, I can get my bib and everything, get myself situated for the race. And that's sort of my routine. It helps me to have that routine from a mental perspective, just because I feel comfortable in the way that I do my things. It kind of helps me to get from being overly anxious about anything. If I don't feel like I have time or feel like I'm rushed, I end up more anxious at the start of the race. So those are types of things I like to sort of have a plan for ahead of time. And I have an order of doing things so that it's not anything I have to think about, because you don't want to have extra variables that you haven't thought about on race morning. And so, I mean, even more though, so like these days, like the races do have added security now. And so, do you need to make sure that what that's going to be like race morning? Then that's something you're going to want to know. Because I know when I raced Philly, they had it really locked down. And so you kind of needed to know exactly what you were getting yourself into the day before, so that you weren't late to the starting line, because the lines getting in were very long. So those types of things are things that you want to know ahead of time so you can prepare for, which maybe not part of your pre-race routine and something you can practice in training, but still something that you're going to want to know going into that goal race.
Yeah, I think pre-planning some of those race day logistics is definitely important. I'm curious on the routine piece. You mentioned how you'll actually practice the UCAN and the other pieces of your pre-race fuel for most workouts. How rigid are you with that, especially now when you're not actually regularly running? Is that something you still fuel with to stay in touch on how you're going to fuel for race day?
Yeah, for the most part, lately I haven't been doing as much of it, just because I'm going to save my fuel that I have for when I get back to running. And I'm also not doing a whole lot of intensity where I'm probably going to be at that same carb burning ratio. But if I was doing, say, a hard workout on the bike, I would fuel the same way. Right now, I've just been doing some aqua jogging and I'm trying to keep fitness, but not necessarily go crazy with it. So, but generally, like if I was doing something hard on the bike, I would take some UCAN and do all that stuff beforehand and sort of kind of emulate that in a lot of ways so that my body's still used to it when I get back to a normal regimen of training. But I think the one reason I haven't been necessarily doing that is like I said, I'm trying to conserve my things so that I'm not just like spending tons of money while I'm not running, so I can save it for when I am running. I mostly just like to use UCAN for just general everyday health too, because it's a good. You want to make sure I'm getting enough protein, so I use their protein stuff for after, and that kind of things can still be valuable from an everyday training perspective for when I am back to running. I want to make sure that I have been fueling well and have been taking care of myself in a way that's going to benefit me, so that when I do start running, I'll be able to really hit the ground running, and I guess kind of literally. So, yeah.
Yeah, it definitely makes it a lot easier when you've practiced. I probably tend to start taking more gels 2 to 3 months out because I find it's enough time, but it's really that same reason. The price of gels really add up, but I do find it is beneficial to make sure you're practicing and not just saving them for race day.
Yeah, I mean, your body needs to know how to process them and utilize them quickly, and that takes practice 100%, just like anything else. Like you need to know how your body takes them in when you're running slowly, and you need to know how your body takes it in running fast. And you also need to know sort of how much you specifically need, because I find this with hydration. The hydration, I think, is the biggest piece that with fueling, is so individualized that it's hard for anyone. It's hard for us as coaches, I think, to give exact science because everyone has different sweat rate. Everyone has drastically different sodium losses. We know that sodium is one of those electrolytes that's lost in different quantities, and it's a huge spectrum, right? The other ones are pretty standard for the most part. There's going to be some variable, but not quite as wide as sodium. So, but you could be a heavy sweater, but not a salty sweater, and you could be a salty sweater, but so those are things that are like take a lot of individual understanding of what your body is doing and monitoring that. So that's something I've been doing because I'm finding that I feel like my most limited factor, my fueling seems like it's been good. I use UCAN gels every, say, 30, 40-ish minutes or something like that, closer to like 35, 40. But what I feel like has been my limit has been more my hydration. I think I'm a really salty sweater. And so really figuring out ways to actually get enough in has been my biggest challenge. And so it feels like I'm taking so much in and I'm like, I have to do more than what the bottle says, which I'm like, is that too much sodium? But you know, we all lose it at different rates. And I find myself having the salt on my skin. So the only way that I know what's going to work for race day is if I really practice it and test it and sort of, you know, even in this hot weather, like how many salt tablets, how much fluid do I individually need to feel good through an entire run when it's hot? And, you know, in some ways, the heat is a different factor that like you may not feel good because your body temperature is getting too high when it's hot. But from a hydration perspective, you'll know those types of things. You start having that dehydrated feeling. And so that one I think is probably the most crucial for most people. But if you're not someone who's feeling the effects of the hydration issues quite as much, it may not be something you have to practice as much. But if you're like me, you probably need to do a lot of that and recording and sort of paying attention to how much fluid loss you're getting, because this is where the science comes into play.
Yeah, and then that is the next topic I wanted to get to, is kind of your intra-race or during the race fueling. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think you touched on a lot of great points there. So I'll maybe get into some more specific challenges with mimicking your race day fueling, and in particular the fact that I think most runners are not going to cover the actual full distance of a marathon in their race day and are probably not going to have the support of having aid stations while they're doing their training run. So how can you make sure that you're mimicking what that race day fueling is going to look like, even if the conditions might look a little bit different in training?
Yeah, so one of the things I will say is that in training, you are going to be in a higher glycogen deficiency than you would be on race day because you're going to be fully loaded going into race day if you did all the carbo loading and all the things to prep for going into the race, and you know, you decrease volume so that you can store more, you can get all those glycogen stores up. But in training, you're going to be at a deficit. So from that perspective, even if you're not going a full 26 miles, you're still going to be probably starting that run with less glycogen. So you're going to be sort of practicing what that's going to be like in the middle parts of the races, which is where we that fueling really makes an impact, is when your glycogen is starting to go down and you're trying to replace and keep up with it. So when we're starting long runs already sort of in a slightly depleted state, then that's going to sort of still give us that advantage of practicing on. So you're going to feel like towards the end of your long run, whether it be only 20 miles or 22 or 18, you're going to feel like you would towards the end of a race, just because you're going to be depleted in some regard because of the fact that we're not tapered, we're not glycogen filled, all those things aren't really taking place quite as much. So that's one thing I will say with the long runs and never really going 26 is that we still get that training in. We still know what that feels like. But when it comes to your fueling, when you're not running quite as hard either, you're going to be burning a little bit more of a mixture of fat and carb and not just carbohydrate. Whereas when you get tired or when you're running your goal pace, you may be burning a little bit more carbohydrate to start there, and you'll convert fully to carbohydrate by the end. But in some of your easy long runs, you're practicing your fueling, you may not necessarily be completely depleting your glycogen. You may be burning a combination of fuel sources just because of the fact that your heart rate's not getting up as much or any of those types of things. Like, we may not see that happening, but it still benefits you to train your body to know how to convert the fuel that you're bringing in to energy. So your body actually needs practice at doing that. It's not necessarily just innate that it just knows exactly how and what to do. The more that you practice it, the more that your body's able to take in and store and do something with. If you're not practicing it a lot in training, then your body may not necessarily know how to convert that and use it and help you. So even if you did get to race day and we're following the guidelines of some, whatever it is, 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate an hour, it may be too much for your stomach to handle, and it won't be able to get as much as it needs. And then you'll find yourself bonking because your stomach just couldn't handle what it needed to replace all that glycogen. So when we practice that kind of stuff, that helps us just to sort of get a good measure on, well, it helps us to just be able to take in more so that we have more on board. But then the other part of that is that when you're fueling, you learn to how much you specifically need, because we're all different. Like, they have that range for a reason. And so like if you're, I'm 5 feet tall, 100 something pounds, versus somebody who is, 6'8" or something crazy like that, who's running a marathon, like they're going to need to fuel probably a lot different than say I would. So those are things that you'll know based on kind of how you feel when you do fuel. And that could be that sometimes you sort of practice like taking fuel and then seeing how, when you start to feel like you're getting depleted, and then knowing when that point is, so that when you are in a race setting, you take that preemptively. You take it before you would reach that point. So say you feel like you're doing a workout or something, and you take a gel at 60 minutes, and then 60 minutes later, you're starting to feel depleted. Then you probably want to start in races or in harder efforts, anything like that, starting at 45. And then if you test that out and you start to feel like you're getting depleted at 45, back that off even more to 30 or something like that. So it's really getting a good sense of what you need and how you want to balance that. The hard, like you said, with the not being able to carry everything on you, I think that's one of the biggest challenges. It's something I have run into, and I don't know how people do it. It's like, so you can wear a vest, you can try things like that. The challenge with vests is that they can bounce a little bit, or they can be a little bit annoying from that front. They also are added weight. So if you're a little bit slower, then that's okay. Know that that's okay, that's fine. That it's not your fitness. It's like running with a weighted vest on, right? So like those types of things, just be mindful of it if you're trying those out. I just bought I don't know if it'll work, but I bought like one that I didn't like running in my vest. So I bought one that was sort of like a little bit of a fanny pack that had still a bladder in it. So I wanted to see if that would work for me, but I haven't been running, so I don't know. But these are things that if you can just practice it in training and bring what you need in training. I know it's difficult, but it'll help. It'll help to kind of make you feel better, help to make your recovery even better. So that's the other side of this, is that in training, we're practicing for race day, but we're also helping our body to recover faster. So when you take fuel on and when you take hydration on the run, you are benefiting yourself post-run, just doing those things, because your body is going to be in a better state post-run, better hydrated, so that we can better fuel, and so then we can better recover our muscles, all that stuff. But yeah, so I think even from that perspective, like your fueling during the run has so much value to you that just, wear some shorts with pockets, try to fit them in every different place that you can to make sure that you can get it. You can also, stash things if you're able to in places that you can go pick it up on the way if you want to practice grabbing. I one time did a workout on the track and put a table for myself so I can grab stuff off of it and practice sort of all that kind of things. And I like the track for practicing fueling sometimes, because you don't have to necessarily carry everything, but you can run by, grab it, and continue running, and then drop it if you need to, and then come back and pick it up, because you're always going to have that consistency of it still being there. So that's something you can do, and I think is worth it if you're trying to sort of see what race conditions will be like to be in a setting where you are doing laps and you can keep going back to your fluids or your fuel or any of those things.
Yeah, I think that idea with the track is really smart. It kind of relates to something I do too that I find works, which is kind of piecemealing the different elements of your race day. So, for example, I'll wear that vest and practice my hydration on a long, slow, easy run. But then if it's a faster run, I might do things a little bit differently, and just know that I'm practicing the pacing, and I'll have a different opportunity to practice the hydration side. So I think probably a good message there, that you don't have to do everything all at once, perfect every time.
Yeah, you don't have to do it every time. I kind of am like, I will be more specific on certain runs, and then other runs I'll be like a little bit more lazy about getting all those things together, because that takes prep. You're like, all right, let me make sure I grab my water bottles and all these things. And so it's kind of like, yeah, practice it when it works. Do it a few times in training. Practice it more if it's your first time. But if you're sort of gotten used to it, you still want to do it, but you don't necessarily have to you don't have to do it every time. You can really be choosy on when it makes sense and when it doesn't.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we pretty well covered the nutrition and hydration side, so I'll move on more to the racing conditions. And I think there's two main things that come to mind when I think of practicing your racing conditions. One is the race profile, so I'm thinking like, what is the terrain you're running on? Is it hilly or flat? The other piece is really what weather do you expect, and in practicing with that. So how can runners make sure that they are prepared for whatever the conditions may be for their chosen race?
Yeah, so I think that we get this question a lot too. I think on Runners Connect when athletes are like, oh, my race is really hilly. I need lots of hills in my training. And it's not necessarily that you need just hill training. It's that you might need to do some of your efforts on hills, right? So you might need to do some of your tempo efforts on hills. So not necessarily worrying about pace, like we talked about. You want to practice what that pacing strategy should be for that race course. So even if the pace says X, think about any paces that you're given based on your PRs or whatever paces that your coaches give you, they're going to be mostly assuming almost perfect conditions, right? Because that's what your PRs are based on. So that's how we know that's how we give paces, but those aren't going to be accurate all the time because you're not always getting perfect conditions. And so when you're given a pace, it's kind of like give yourself a spectrum. Don't feel like you have to aim for the fast end of that spectrum every time. If you're training for a race that you know is not going to be as fast as what you ran your PR in, what's a reasonable estimate for the same effort level for the conditions? And making sure that that's what you're targeting in training. So when you're doing, if a tempo workout says 2 by 2 miles at 9:20 pace, and you're like, I don't know if I'll be able to handle that on this hilly course. I'm going to do this on a hilly course. What's a reasonable pace for me to sort of shoot for on this hilly course that I'm going to do this workout on? And kind of give yourself that sort of perspective, and then practicing the ups and downs, like I mentioned, being slower on the ups, a little bit faster on the down, and balancing what that effort should feel like. So it's not necessarily that if you're running a hilly race, you have to just do tons of hill workouts. Like we can transform. You can do any of your longer efforts, your tempos, your thresholds. We can do those on courses that are rolling or anything that'll mimic your race day. Other with the heat and the humidity and all that stuff, that's something that I think that can be one of the most challenging things to prepare for if you're racing and I think we had this in Boston this year, where conditions in Boston were significantly warmer than most people had up until that point. I think that the weather had been fairly cool and mild and a lot better conditions for training through most of the winter and up until Boston. Like even in North Carolina, my wedding was the weekend before, and I remember I ran in long sleeves on my shakeout runs those mornings. Like it was chilly, right? And then Boston comes and it's 70. So a lot of people didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to prepare for that because their weather outside was not conducive to that. But there's things like I've seen, and this may not be something that everyone can take advantage of, but like using a sauna and stuff like that, just sort of sitting in the sauna can just kind of get yourself prepared for some of that heat acclimation if race day is going to be hotter than where you're training. Those are things you can do. I've seen people wear, more layers than they need in running in outside or running on the treadmill, and more layers than they might actually need to stay warm. Just so they're sort of getting their body temp up a little bit so that they're experiencing sort of what it would feel like to be a little bit warmer. We want to be careful with that kind of stuff, though. You don't want to overheat yourself. You don't want to cause yourself more issues, but it's just some things that you can test out in training just to kind of get yourself in somewhat of a way of what it's going to be like when you get to your goal race. And those are things that like wearing more layers is easy to do. Like you can do that no matter where you live. You can throw on more. If you're living in like the depths of a very cold climate, then that's going to be something where you're probably going to have to go indoors to do. And if you have that accessibility, great. But if you're living in an area that's cold, but like you can just throw on tons of layers and just go run hard or whatever and sort of get your body temp up, then that's still going to give us some benefit there. Other things that we can think about, if it's going to rain on your race day, this is something that's probably more that like you're not going to be able to just decide on race week that you're going to go do a run in the rain to prepare for it because it may not rain on race week. This is where in training, if it's going to rain, it's not storming, but it's raining, it's okay. You can do a workout in the rain. It's you might have rain on race day. When you're looking at a forecast and it's if as long as it's not like unsafe conditions, if it's just like a rainy day, you probably should go still do your workout in it, so that just in case, if that's what race day is like, you know how to handle it. And I think that we can use Boston as another example, because the year before this last one, it was raining. And so then there was the whole conversation of, what do you do with your shoes? How do you manage all of those pieces? And those are things you can practice. Like if you're like, oh, it's raining, great, I'm going to test out what I'm going to do and how things are going to feel if it races. Like, do I need to wear plastic bags over my shoes or something like that? Like, those are days that we can get something out of it. So like, don't be afraid of a rainy day. It might be good for us to at least have some practice, as long as it's safe, as long as there's no threat of any flooding or huge thunderstorms or anything like that. Then don't be afraid of that. The other thing is, like, if you're running a trail race, we want to do some of our training on trails. We don't have to do all of it on trails, of course. Like, if you want to we can still do speed workouts that are on the roads, just to kind of still work on our strength and our fitness. But then we can also do some of our workouts on trails to just to do them on the similar terrain. But again, all of this requires that we give ourselves that space on our paces to be slower, or to kind of adjust based on what the conditions and the feel and the terrain is going to provide. And so it's all going to you can do any of this stuff on different varying terrains. We just have to be mindful of how those things might impact us and be willing to adjust for those conditions. We're not going to be able to just keep things super precise when we're doing different things, or else it would be like we'd see these crazy fast times on the trails too, right? Like, trail races is going to be a little bit slower than the roads. Typically, that's what we normally see. And if that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't see a big difference in paces. So if you think about it from that perspective, it's okay to be slower if you're training on different terrain. Your GPS may also be awful. Like, it may not pick up. It may be just completely inaccurate on the trails. So knowing that, you might even just be like, I'm just going to go by effort on this, which it might also be what you have to do on race day. So those are some things I'd keep in mind when it comes to all that stuff. And then when we're talking about stress and crowds and stuff, that crowds and things, like, you may not really ever get a huge opportunity to be impacted by that when you're in training, unless, I don't know, you have a club that you run with and you're able to go be surrounded by tons of people. But, most people are not necessarily going to have that at their disposal. So, from a stress perspective, this is something where it's hard for you really to prepare. But one thing that I had a sports psychologist sort of tell me to do was actually sort of put myself in the position of like, what would I do if something that would stress me out happened? And so we were talking about this from this perspective of, I was kind of nervous that I was going to run. I hadn't been running well in every race. It was kind of like it would just sort of go south at a certain point. So I was racing sort of with that expectation. And so he asked me, okay, what would be the time, or what would you have to run for you to be really upset? And then I said that, and then he was like, okay, so pretend like that's happening right now, and then react to it. So it was sort of training myself to be able to react to whatever I feared the most happening. And when I did that, it takes away sort of some of the other stressors that are a little less meaningless. Like, if the worst thing that could happen to you in your mind on race day is happening, like, who cares if you dropped one of your gels at some point? Like, those things sort of like start having less significance. So we're immune to some of that, but we also have some practice of sort of training ourselves towards what is the thing that we fear that would be the most stressful thing that could happen. And when we have a response to it, it lowers how much it can stress us, because we know how we're going to respond. So I think those are ways that you can prepare yourself for stress, but it's always going to be like, you have to remind yourself that things may not always be perfect. Things could happen on race day that you didn't expect. And as long as you know that ahead of time, and you can have the mindset of like, okay, I'll be fine, everything's gonna be fine, then you'll probably come out of it better. I ran a half before I ran Philly last year, and it was the local half, and I was doing it as sort of a practice run for my practice run for Philly. And I forgot my bib, and I had driven downtown, and then I had to run back to my house, which granted, it wasn't that far from where the race was, but it was far enough. Like, I did a longer warm up than I intended, like much longer than I intended. And I got back to my car, changed my shoes, and was still like a decent distance from the race start. So I was running down the street as everyone's lined up on the course. And I'm like, it was like 4 minutes to race day. And I was like, well, okay, I got this under my belt. If something happens in Philly and I end up having this scenario, like, it'll be fine. You know, that was probably the first time that like my fear of missing a race start, like the nightmare that I used to have before all my races, was that I was going to miss because I'm always late to things. It was like coming true a little bit there. But it was fine. Everything was fine. And so not that I'm telling people to forget their race bib or just be late to their race, but if it happens, like, it's going to be fine. But also it made me more apt to be like, all right, be better prepared. Have your bib in your bag the night before. So I put my bib in my backpack now, like when I'm thinking about it. Like, I'm going to do this right now so that tomorrow morning I'm not thinking about it. So, yeah.
This feels like a runner's twist on like very common nightmares. I feel like a lot of people have nightmares about missing like tests when they're in school, about being late to work. But this feels very relatable about missing the start for your race.
Yeah, I feel like I haven't had it as much recently when I've been racing, but I used to have this dream all the time that I'd get to the race when I thought was the right time, and the race would have already gone off, and then I'd have to just be trying to play catch up with everybody. And like half the time it would be like, oh, we started like 2 hours ago. No. And so like that, and I feel like I'm not alone in that. I don't know if you've ever had that, but I used to have this dream before every one of my big races. So I even had a dream one time where we started racing, and then somebody while we were racing told me that they weren't going to have any fuel on the course and you had to bring it yourself. And that was like, oh my God. And like I was freaking out because I didn't have anything. Yeah. Things like that.
Yeah, I don't think I've had that specific nightmare of like missing the start of the race, but I've definitely had dreams where it's like suddenly you forget how to run or you're slower. But there was actually a local race in my area where I had a lot of people have that nightmare play out because it was like a local 5K and they had published a time that was like 15 minutes different. So they actually had to like correct results because a lot of people missed the start.
Oh man. Oh, oof. That would be stressful. I could see that being, especially if it's 15 minutes earlier than you thought and you're just sort of like not ready for it. Yeah. There was a race here locally where there was a girl running the 5K and she didn't realize it was on the track. So on the track, like the finish is different than the start for the 5K. She was standing near the start or the finish line and realized, oh shoot, right, it's over there. So she's like sprinting across the infield trying to get to the start line. And it took off. She was started like 50 meters behind everybody. And I was like, oh, this is my nightmare. It's happening. But she did fine.
Good that was on a track. I could see at a marathon, you could be like miles away if you went to the finish line.
Oh yeah, for sure, right? Especially if you're in like Boston, right? You're 26.2 miles away.
You're gonna have to run 2 marathons just to get to the start line.
There you go.
All right, let's go on to our last topic to practice, which is gear. And I think for a lot of runners, they get excited for race day. You get your shiny new super shoes, your nice singlet, your nice shorts. Do you save it for race day, or do you need to practice with that race kit in advance?
I always practice with the race kit in advance. I will practice the shoes. I won't overuse the shoes because I like to do most of my workouts in something that's not going to be a super shoe or something that's a little bit less, just because, I think that I worry about sort of losing some of my foot strength. There's some other mechanical things only running in super shoes. I think there's can be some challenges if you're doing a lot of your running in those. I really encourage a lot of runners to stick with more of the standard shoe for a lot of their training, especially their easy training runs. And then also for workouts to kind of like occasionally wear the super shoes and then occasionally do something in other types of shoes, a flat, something lightweight or something like that, but not necessarily always using and that also saves your $200, $300 shoes for where it matters a little bit more because they don't last very long. And so you're a lot better off, doing a few key workouts in them and then race day. So I, for a marathon, for instance, like I would wear the shoes I'm planning to wear on race day for maybe one of my long efforts to see how they feel for a long continuous amount of time. And then also one workout that I feel like I'm doing a lot of pace work in. So that's how I will stage it, is maybe do only a couple of workouts in them to make sure I know how they feel, how they're going to work for me. For instance, I got a pair. This was sort of like I didn't have enough time to practice in them. And generally, like from every other time that I've gotten a new pair of shoes and worn them, I've never had this issue before. But I had a pair of the Nike Alpha Fly 2s, I think. And I wore them for a workout that was 2 by 5 miles. It was 2 by 5 miles with 4 miles at marathon pace, 1 mile faster at the end in both sets. And I thought, perfect, I'll do my workout on this. It's a long effort with lots of marathon pace work in it, a lot of pace work. It'll be perfect. So I wear them, and I got halfway out and my feet were blistering so bad. Like I got these huge blisters, both feet, on the arch of my foot. And so I was like, it was bad. They were like bigger than a quarter sized blisters. And I then for the next and I think that workout was maybe like 3 or 4 weeks out from race. Maybe it's 3 weeks, maybe I think. It took, because I needed to run still, but then I had these blisters in the least helpful place on my foot. So I was running funny, doing all these things to try not to put stress on that spot. And so it was really impacting the training for the next few weeks as I was trying to taper. And I don't think I really got rid of them until like the week of the race. And when I finally found something that I could use on my feet to help prevent the blisters from reopening or help them heal. So I finally found something that I could run in that didn't hurt. And so then I was like, now what do I do? Like, was that a fluke? Is that what happens with these shoes? That is what happens with those shoes for me. I literally, I was still wearing them occasionally until the last race I ran them in. I was like, no, I'm not doing this again. Because I don't tape up my feet. If I didn't put stuff in my, I forgot what it was called, second skin on my feet and then tape it on my foot, I cannot wear those shoes. They blister every single time. And so
I think a lot of people have that issue with the Alpha Fly too.
Yeah. So it's stuff like that where it's like those things, you don't want those to happen on a race day. It'll ruin your race. I had a race, similar experience with a pair of spikes one time that I was wearing, and they were blistering me in practice a little bit, but I was just being dumb and decided I would just still wear them on race day. And then it just completely distracted me. And I ran a horrible 10K running in them because it was all like, it just hurt so much that I couldn't even focus on running the race hard. Felt like I couldn't even think about doing that. It hurt so bad. Those are the types of things that you want to get out of the way ahead of time. You want to make sure that those things don't happen. Give yourself plenty of space for that. Like if I had tested these shoes maybe 2 months before the race or something farther out, I would have known sooner, and I probably would have had a better ability to get rid of the issues with it, like get rid of these blisters and get back onto my training and be fine. But instead I was like way too close to race day, and they took too long to heal. And so it started to impact me as I was getting closer to race day. So it just sort of was like the perfect storm of what not to do with your racing shoes. So I would practice them ahead of time in a few key workouts, but not every workout. You don't need to do all of them because, again, the cushion on that will compress. And if you do all your workouts in them, you're just going to get a new pair by race day. And God forbid they change something in the shoe between the time, or you get one that's a little bit defective. It may not fit or feel like the exact same shoe, and you still need to do workouts in that one before you race. And so those are like, we don't want to just completely. So if you buy a new shoe for a race that you're doing coming up, plan it out. Know how many miles you're putting on those racing shoes so that you know exactly how long you can wear them. And as a racing shoe before you need to retire them from at least racing. I know some people use them as workout shoes after they've retired them from racing, but just kind of keeping an eye on those types of things. Other equipment that we can talk about, your watch, if you're using it every day, you should be pretty reliable as long as you know how to use it, right? It could always break, but, that's something that, what are you going to do at the end of the day? You're going to have to, that's where knowing how your pace feels comes into play, because as long as there's times on the actual courses, on the monitor of the course. So if you can see what your splits are, you're going to be fine. You're going to know it. But that's where having practiced your pace really well comes into play. It's a good backstop if your watch breaks on race day. That's good to know. Know how your equipment, if you're going to run with a fuel, like a vest or something, know how that's going to feel. If you're going to run with a water bottle in your hand, know how that's going to feel. All those things are things you're going to want to know exactly how you're gonna do it, how you're gonna feel doing it. Are you gonna ditch that bottle at some point? Are you gonna do this or that? And so we want to have all of that nailed down ahead of time. I've seen stories too of people whose race belts or things like that have broken on race day. So do you have a backup? Be prepared with a backup of everything. Like when I'm going to a big race, I pack anything I might need. That's harder when I'm flying. I won't fly like Frontier or any of those airlines when I have a big race I'm going to, because I need to pack everything and I'm not going to be able to just bring a carry-on, right? And I'm not paying for that checked bag. So I kind of like will be like, this is worth it for me to just bring anything I might need, whether that be like you have an extra pair of shorts that's got plenty of pockets in it in case your fuel belt does break, you need to put everything in your pockets, that kind of stuff. So know exactly where and what you're going to do and have a plan for anything that could go wrong on that regard. And yeah, so I would know the last thing I say, and this may not be necessarily something that everyone has to experience, but if you are bringing yourself a water bottle, for instance, like something that I had happened to me in my first marathon, I had bottles out in the course. So for a lot of the elite athletes they're allowed to put bottles out so they can have their personal fuel out on the course. So I had that, but I used bottles I had never used before. So they had these little ice pack cores in the center of them, and for whatever reason, in one of my bottles, I just left it in there. Like I was like, whatever, it'll be fine. The other one I took it out of, and so that one was fine. But when I got to my first bottle on the course, it was completely frozen, and I couldn't get any fuel out of it. So I basically had a wasted, and I didn't have backups. I had a little bit of backup fuel on me, but not enough. So all of that just was like such a mess that, it was because I was being cheap and I just bought bottles from Target, the cheapest ones I could find, and was like, these will be fine. I didn't practice with them. I didn't test them out. I didn't think about the fact that the freezer thing is going to be even more cold when it is 30 degrees outside. So those types of things are things that you want to know ahead of time. So if you're bringing your own bottle and it has a core in the center of it, like maybe if it's hot, that'll be great. If it's not hot, think about it. It may freeze. It may not be the perfect solution. So practice that ahead of time. Know how that stuff works. So you don't run into the problem that I had, which, I wasn't running with that bottle in my hand the entire time, which maybe if I was, it wouldn't have gotten quite as cold, but still, like it really kind of messed up and for me, like that was my first marathon, so I didn't know any better to know like what's going to feel like when I get to the last 10K under fueled, but so I wasn't quite as like stressed about that happening. I was just kind of like, well, that sucks, but we'll move on. Nowadays, I think I would be a little bit more like, oh, great. But I always pack extra stuff on me so that in case that happens, I have extra. So.
Yeah, I get the impression, and let me know if I'm misinterpreting, but it sounds like, practice as much as you can, but you also need to prepare for the fact that stuff will go wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's the inevitable that something may go wrong, and you got to know exactly how you will respond to it. Whether if you don't have backup gels, like that's all there is to it. So like if you don't have them on you, panicking won't make that any better. So what is your response going to be? Can you divert pretty easily and use what's on course? Those kinds of things. So you want to be mindful of like, okay, what is at my disposal? What's going to be on the course? What's going to be available to me at any point in time as I'm racing, so that if anything goes wrong and I don't have the capabilities of providing that thing, there's a backup or there's an option for something. So a lot of this practice is really to practice, preventing catastrophe, but also, giving your body the ability to know how to respond to different stimulus and be ready for anything. So
I certainly hope with this podcast that we've helped at least a few listeners avert catastrophe. For yourself, I know you're not running right now, but whether that's a race or something else, what are you gearing for, preparing for right now?
Hopefully going to be able to start back to running by either September or the end of August here. So sort of counting down the days on that. But, I think for me, I have been working really hard on all of my cross training and my PT and everything because, I just want to be able to come back from the surgery I had and be able to see if I can I don't know if there'll be Olympic trials in the marathon. I'm really hoping they continue that, but that's what would be my goal is in 2028 to be able to get back there. The last time I qualified for Olympic trials, I qualified for with a half and I dropped out for the full marathon there. So, and then I had several struggles of getting back to the Olympic trials, just with different mental health things and other health issues. And now that I'm like, okay, where if we fixed my hip, now let's like not get injured. Let's keep strengthening. Let's get back there. And at the very least, I just want to be able to put together a solid training cycle and really start to see if I can sort of work back to the potential that I felt like I had back when I set all of my PRs and then sort of ran into some other issues. But I'm excited to just see if I can just get there. So my goals are, I feel like, far off, but I think that I'm going to take some stepping stones this fall to get back into racing. And I'm hopeful that by December, I may be able to enter a half if that's possible. And then hopefully maybe in the spring, be looking at a marathon of some sorts or maybe another half. We'll see.
Yeah, those sound like some awesome goals. Good luck with all the preparations and practicing. And thanks for all these fantastic tips on practicing for race day.
Yeah. And if you're racing coming up, hope you have a great race. And I hope all of these things will help you to have at least the most fun, the most stress-free day that you possibly can.
Awesome. Yeah. Good luck to everyone listening.